Coming up, it's your handy-dandy guide to Election Day. We pick apart what's at stake Tuesday on both sides of state line, plus dissecting the week's other top headlines and your newsmakers of the week.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Good to have you with us again. I'm Nick Haynes, and we are on a mission to connect the dots on the most impactful news of our week and give you a heads up on what to expect ahead of Tuesday's election. Working overtime to ensure you know what's happening. From 41 Action News, Kat Reed. From the Call newspaper, senior reporter Eric Wesson. From the Shawnee Mission Post, Jay Center. And from the pages of your Kansas City Star, Dave Helling. Now, while there are literally hundreds of races being decided throughout the metro on Tuesday, the issue getting most attention has been this one. Should Kansas City take down Dr. Martin Luther King's name from a 10-mile stretch of street in the city and return it to what it used to be called the Paseo? The new signs have only been up for about 9 months.
We are here because for 51 years, Kansas City has not taken appropriate action.
That's a lot of address changes. That's a lot of confusion in the next 6 months.
It has a 120-year history of being the Paseo.
Some voices, some faces on both sides of this issue. What happens if you vote yes on Tuesday, Eric?
If you vote yes, then it remains. If you vote,
This is the problem.
if you vote yes, then you want it to go back to Paseo. If you vote no, then it stays MLK Boulevard.
Can I just say, the way to think of this if you're going to the poll is, let's imagine a road. If you want it to be the Paseo, vote yes. If you want it to be Martin Luther King, vote no.
Wow, this is already more confusing than I expected the show to be, Kat.
Well, and quickly, Nick, let's talk a little bit about the cost of this. So far, they've spent $60,000 on the new Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. signs, and reverting them back would cost $30,000 to $40,000. So we're talking about a $100,000 investment for this whole debacle. The good news is they haven't destroyed the Paseo signs yet. They've held on to those, so hopefully some of them could be reused.
If voters do, though, decide to take down the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sign, put back up the Paseo sign, I'm assuming then this is not the end of the issue. Will there be another effort to find something else to name after Dr. King, whether it be the airport or a different street?
I think they would go back to trying to do the street again.
The same street or a different?
The same street, and I think they would go the different route with the signatures and going through the procedure and having the community input from it, because that's one of the biggest things that people have complained about is that they didn't get an opportunity. And you kind of have to live outside of Kansas City to not know that there were meetings where it was discussed, but people don't feel like they were engaged. So I believe it would go back to that.
I wouldn't completely rule out 63rd Street coming back into the conversation again, since that had been part of the initial panel looking at recommendations. The reason why Paseo was always considered more attractive was because of the dedicated funding through the boulevard system.
Why is it always these changes of bridges and roads always taking place on the Missouri side of the state line? We had also Emmanuel Cleaver Boulevard. There used to be Brush Creek Boulevard. Now we have the Buck O'Neill Bridge. It was the Broadway Bridge for so many decades. Why don't we hear about that in Johnson County, that they're going to change Knoll Avenue or Metcalf and rename it something, Jay?
Well, I mean, in the case of the MLK and honoring him, I mean, it's worth pointing out Johnson County was almost entirely white at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. Johnson County Museum documents, the history of racist housing policies that led to that. So, hasn't been as much of a thrust there. As the demographics in Johnson County change over the next several years, we might see something change there. But there aren't as many avenues for people in Johnson County to sort of bring these sorts of proposals to the attention of their elected officials.
Because citizens can't just gather petitions in Johnson County or in Kansas to do these things.
They can, but the bar is so very, very high that as a practical matter, it's impossible. It is not impossible, as we know, in Kansas City, Missouri. And what Eric is suggesting is that after this election, there's a possibility of another petition drive, maybe 63rd Street, maybe the Paseo, maybe another street. I do think there's a sense that if the voters ratify the King name for the old Paseo, that will put an end to it, that people will accept that verdict and we'll all go forward. if it's put back to the Paseo, then I do think we're in for more task forces. And by the way, my friend Eric Wesson could certainly serve on one of those task forces since he was on the mayor's task force on this issue, as we recall. So I think that there's a lot at stake Tuesday. This argument has gone on for 18 months, nearly 2 years. If it goes back to the Paseo, I think we are going to continue to talk about it for some time.
And you know, one of the things that has always been a part of the conversation is honoring Dr. King, and people feel like the street is the honor. But is honoring Dr. King the way you live your life? Or is it putting a name on a street or a building? Because we've got MLK Junior High School, we've got MLK Park, we've got the longest week-long celebration honoring Dr. King in the country. We have things that are named after Dr. King. Let's try living a life that Dr. King would be proud of.
Now, all around the metro, there are hundreds of local school boards, city council, community college, even water board races on the ballot. If you're headed into Johnson County in the last few days, you might have noticed it's now a sea of yard signs dotting every single spare patch of grass on the side of a road. It's tough to weigh in on every single issue. In fact, it would take us more than the length of this program just to list off the candidates. But Jay Center, in terms of importance, what's the biggest race being decided in Johnson County and why?
I am keeping my eye on the Overland Park City Council races. I think the direction of the city really hangs in the balance in a lot of ways. For the past probably 20 years, it's fair to say, it's been pretty slow and steady going for the city government. There's been consensus. We want to be pro-growth. We want to be pro-development. We want to make it as easy as possible to do business in Overland Park as possible. Over the last 4 or 5 years, you've seen pockets of the community step forward and say, listen, we don't want to bend over backwards for developers and make it possible for them to do whatever they want. We want to make sure that the northern parts of the city are getting as much attention as they need to stay vibrant as we're spending kind of spurring development of the southern parts of the city. So all 6 of the seats that are up in this cycle have contested races. You've got pretty much an establishment, let's keep going the way we are candidate, and hey, let's put the brakes on some of this stuff and reconsider how we're doing business candidate. If a couple of those anti-establishment candidates make it through, I really think you could see the direction.
We're going to talk a little bit more of those issues in Overland Park in just a moment, but there is a big crowd also running for the Johnson County Board of Trustees. What's at stake here? Would the entire direction of the college as we know it change as a result of who gets elected on Tuesday, Dave?
I'm not sure it would change completely, but there are disagreements on the board, and there are arguments for different slates of people that are running. Some of the incumbents want to continue the board or the school on the path that it is now on, whereas others suggest there's a need for change. I've talked about this on the show before, Nick. The Johnson County Community College is a major asset, and I do think more people are paying attention to the governance there, salaries paid to professors, expansion plans, other things. There was, as you know, a big dispute over closing the track and doing some other things out at the college. So I think I'm watching that race and to see if Johnson Countyans are riled up about the state of their community.
Well, and the big thing is the board's going to choose the next president. Joe Sopcich has announced he's stepping down next year. So this is whoever is in those seats is going to have the final say over who's the new leader.
And by the way, Jay Center at the Shawnee Mission Post is probably the only place where you can find much reporting about who's running and the differences between the candidates in these Johnson County races. If you go to the kcpt.org/KCWIR site. We have linked you to his work. We also have a link where you can just plug in your zip code on both sides of state line and see side-by-side comparisons of the candidates in almost every race and where they stand on the issues. In the Star this week, there's a big spotlight on the thousands of candidates running for the water board in Johnson County. Now, I'm exaggerating slightly, of course, but why such an interest in what some view as the lowest level of elected office in the metro, Kat Reed?
Well, I think this is part of a broader movement we've seen since 2016 of a lot of people getting involved, younger, more diverse candidates getting involved in local races, and they cite different issues. Some are talking about climate change. They're talking about the Missouri River riverbed and damage to it, as well as talking about public health crises like what we have seen in Flint and Newark and how we can prevent those locally.
Are we seeing that sort of energy and passion on the Missouri side of the state line, even in those lower ballot races, Eric?
No. You have to really think about there actually being an election Tuesday.
Yeah, I couldn't actually see I went out I actually used my camera phone to pick out those yard signs in Johnson County. I went all around Missouri. I couldn't find many.
Exactly, but you know, Wyandotte County has a big race, and it's quiet, and it's a pretty big race. And one of the interesting things about it is that you have a growing Hispanic community there. And one of the candidates is running on the fact that they need Hispanics on the city council.
What's at stake in the Wyandotte County races? We certainly do not want to forget about them.
Well, the commission, of course, that Eric just mentioned.
Nearly half of the seats.
Yes, and that's important. And Ann Murguia, of course, is a bit of a lightning rod, and so we'll be watching that race a little bit. I'm also fascinated by the fact that the Water Board has contested races for every seat, I think is correct, which is absolutely astonishing for that race. BPU elections are important in Kansas City, Kansas. The Board of Public Utilities is a job provider for some people. Those are hotly contested. So now,
and
whether
the
they'll
school
be
district
and the school district. Now, whether that juices turnout or not, I don't know. It's difficult to know how to cast intelligent voices and votes in these races. And let me just echo what you said. Jay's website is phenomenal,
yes.
and I'm a subscriber, as you know, and so I just recommend that people go there if they want to get down and dirty
Absolutely.
on these candidates.
Let's put that website back on the screen if we can, because even when we talk about Wyandotte County, I think KCUR has done a good job of back-to-back comparisons of the candidates running for the county commission there. We've put that on there too to try and link all of those names together to make it easier for you to find out who to vote for. It's not getting a massive amount of attention, but if you live in Kansas, you'll also be voting on a statewide ballot question. Missouri voters are very familiar with seeing a whole lot of ballot questions. It's very rare in Kansas. This is to do with the census. What are voters being asked, Kate?
So this is all about the state's census adjustment. Kansas is the only state in the union that has this adjustment. It was passed back in the 80s, and it basically allows members of the military and college students to claim a different home address in the census if they choose. So the argument about this is that it is very tedious. The Secretary of State's office is having to call all of these people and ask them. A lot of people don't have landlines anymore, so they're hard to get in touch with. And the state claims that this is costing about $835,000 when the census rolls around. They say it's tedious, cumbersome, and it's time for it to go.
So every election always has a winner and a loser associated with it. Are there winners to this election and losers to this election, Jay?
Yeah, I've talked to a Johnson County legislator who said that basically when this came up in committee and was being discussed early this session, the areas that have a lot of these college students living in them are in favor of it because they are going to be able to argue for more funding for services based on that higher population figure. Rural communities are less enchanted by this because they're likely to have their...
But I'm assuming Johnson County would also lose if you have a lot of folks who are going to higher education institutions like K-State and KU from Johnson County. They're now going to be counted in those college towns, aren't they?
That is correct, although the Johnson County delegation was largely supportive of the measure.
And can I just say quickly, my understanding is the change only applies to state House and state Senate races. It doesn't apply to U.S. House redistricting. It is, however, Nick, an indication of the fight over the 2020 census and redistricting in both Missouri and Kansas. That's always a nightmare. It'll be a nightmare again this year. This is sort of the opening salvo in that.
Now, in other news, Mayor Quinton Lucas unveiling a new fix to curbing rising violent crime. He's proposing a new city ordinance that would take guns away from domestic violence abusers.
Will create a municipal violation for the unlawful carrying of firearms in Kansas City by anyone who is subject to a restraining order that's been issued by a court or is convicted of a crime of domestic violence, misdemeanor, or felony.
How big a problem is that, Kat?
A huge problem. If you talk to anyone who works in the domestic violence sector, this is huge. They end up back with their guns and people are in danger. Their victims are in danger. I think that it's interesting to see how in the beginning of his time in office, Quinton Lucas has really focused on federal legislation and what we can do here locally to make sure that it is really being implemented. Because the issue is that prosecutors, federal prosecutors, don't necessarily have the time or the resources to prosecute all of these things. So that's why they're arguing for the local enforcement.
If this is such a big problem, then, Eric, why didn't Sly James do this during his 8 years in office when he was also concerned about violent crime?
Probably the same groups that are lobbying Mayor Lucas probably didn't lobby Mayor James. And Mayor James' focus was a little bit different when it came to violent crime. His focus was let the police do their job, and whereas Mayor Lucas is stepping up, taking the shots for violent crime in Kansas City.
I think Mayor Lucas and his team are busy probing the limits of what the city can do to deal with gun violence and what legislation, what ordinances conflict with state law or may be congruent with federal law. I mean, I think they're trying to find out where the boundary line is. But I also believe that the mayor and his people believe that 2020 will be the year that crime really needs to come down in Kansas City, and that he, Mayor Lucas, will be judged on the efficacy of what the city does to bring down violent crime. I don't think they can affect it in 2019, but people will judge him on what happens next year, and this is part of that.
Now, we always talk about crime and the number of murders in Kansas City, Missouri, but violent crime is happening with greater frequency all over the metro, including murders. This week, a business owner is shot dead outside of his office building near 135th and Metcalf in Overland Park. Jay Center, is crime an issue that is playing out in any of these election campaigns being waged in Johnson County?
Yeah, in the city council elections in Overland Park, you've heard people address it. Most significantly, there was a string of 3 pretty high-profile violent crimes in one neighborhood in northern Overland Park in January, I believe. The police department has been making pretty concerted efforts to increase communication with the neighborhoods. Hey, what are the things we can do to prevent this from happening? How can we make sure that you're letting us know if you see something you don't like? The problems in Overland Park and the rest of Johnson County are not as prevalent as in Kansas City, Missouri. I think residents are looking to make sure that it stays that way.
You mentioned economic development is becoming a concern. You know, crime is a rising issue. What about affordable housing? That's also an issue you hear about constantly in Kansas City, Missouri. In fact, a boisterous rally this week outside of City Hall. Tenants groups demanding the council enact a new Tenants' Bill of Rights. Are candidates ringing alarm bells in the suburbs about affordable housing too?
It's been a kind of sort of unexpectedly a bigger issue in this campaign than I'd expected. United Services of Johnson County, United Community Services Johnson County is conducting an audit of housing options in the county. Basically, what's the trend is there are more and more jobs in Johnson County that just don't pay enough for people to actually live and work in their backyard. So.
And in Kansas City, Missouri, as we see those tenants' rights groups, going outside of City Hall, demanding a Bill of Rights for tenants, Quinton Lucas has said he's supportive of this, but he's just one vote on the city council.
Mm-hmm. And I think the others, just for the sake of saving face, I think they would be supportive of it as well. But there are going to get some pushback from the landlords with this as well. Some of the things that
they've actually come together this week to put their own Bill of Rights together, even changing their name from landlords to home providers because of the pejorative term.
Absolutely, because of the negative connotations with it. But I think that there's going to be a pushback. But again, the question is, what is affordable housing? What's affordable for Dave, a multimillionaire, is not affordable for me as a poor person.
Well, in other news, it is now official. The USDA has picked downtown Kansas City as the new headquarters for hundreds of research workers being moved out of our nation's capital and into the heartland. There were lots of sites being considered, including Crown Center and the emptying Sprint campus in Johnson County. Why downtown, and where are they going to be, Kat?
Well, they stand to benefit from some pretty attractive incentives going downtown, and the site they've chosen is 805 Pennsylvania Avenue downtown, as you see images of downtown there in the video.
Now, this is about $26 million or so of potential tax incentives. Now, is that different, though? And there's a lot of pushback about that. But is this really different than other companies who are coming into town and the kind of incentives they would get?
It's a little more aggressive than some incentives, and it's for an existing building. It's not for a new project, so keep that in mind. But the federal government isn't just another business. It's the federal government. And it can print money. And it usually taps every taxpayer in America to pay rent. And in essence, what's happening here is the people of Missouri and Kansas City are going to subsidize what the people of the United States used to pay just to bring in this these USDA jobs. I do think that it's going to pass. I don't think anybody's going to block it. But people are starting to say, well, what was the benefit to Kansas City other than the headlines and the sort of talking points? What benefit really is there for the state of Missouri and for the people of Kansas City? And that's a very difficult question to answer.
Now, one of the sites that was proposed for this J Center was the Sprint campus. And is there disappointment and indignation in Johnson County that it's not going to be moving there?
I haven't heard a whole lot of vocal disappointment, but it would have been very nice. And we're gonna have to figure out what to do with that real estate. I mean, when Sprint initially came in, it totally blew up the real estate market in Johnson County. With it emptying out, I think it's going to have a similar effect.
But this is the second loss in just a few weeks. You know, Waddell and Reed now coming out of Overland Park to go onto the Missouri side of state line, building a new skyscraper downtown.
With incentives.
And it's interesting, even on the USDA, because this is the site, Kansas is the site for the largest research facility now being built, the National Bioscience Research Facility in Manhattan, Kansas.
Right.
So this has to be a loss for them.
Right. Well, yeah, I think Kansas competed for this business and was prepared to offer incentives as well. I do think Missouri had a bit of a leg up because of the politics of it and because there was vacant space downtown, and it's a little easier to see incentives. And by the way, $20 million of the incentives can be approved by the Port Authority, which is not subject to a vote of the City Council or anyone. So the path of least resistance is through John Stevens' group, and they, of course, endorsed that this week.
Last week, it was MoDOT apologizing for editing out President Trump's name and Make America Great Again logo from a child's T-shirt. This week, it's one of our region's most prestigious universities. MU says they made a mistake in a social media campaign that presented student athletes and showed only the white students with big career goals like future doctor and future corporate financier, while black students were identified with captions such as, "I am an African-American woman and I am a brother." Would there have been, though, as much attention to this story if MU hadn't already just gone through several episodes of racial tension and had promised to be more sensitive to diversity issues, Eric?
Yeah, it would have totally been indifferent. That was insulting. And for people that went to school there, it was insulting to the students. It's like, we can't achieve, we got people there that are studying to be engineers, doctors, and they're just saying, well, we're African Americans. So that was very insulting.
I think that this would have blown up regardless because it was
Even if it was
Twitter.
a K-State or KU?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because I think it's huge, and anyone could look at that and immediately see what the problem was. So,
But they didn't, though, Dave.
Right, and you know, anyone who's ever worked with a college or university bureaucracy knows about approximately 700 people probably looked at that ad before it was posted. I mean, it wasn't like, hey, let's just throw this up there. So it's a systemic failure, and they do need to go back and figure out how this kind of thing could happen.
But they've apologized, the university. Is that the end of the story?
You know, I think if you listen to what the students who are actually in the ads had to say, it seems like on campus it might be the end of the story because they said, listen, I did say that. I wasn't really offended by it, but I see where people could be upset. So I don't know that there will be as much of a student controversy since the students actually featured seem to be okay now.
Now, lots of apologizing going on even among our local election candidates running for the Johnson County Community College Board of Trustees. Greg Musil apologizes for what some say was his mocking of gender pronouns when he said at a forum, he, she, or it. And a candidate for the city council in Roland Park apologizing for retweets on his social media account, including one that labeled Barack Obama an anti-Christian, pro-Islamic Muslim traitor. Jay Center, is there any evidence that despite the publicity these stories are getting, that they're having any impact on those campaigns?
We will have to wait until Tuesday to find out. These are such low turnout elections that really it's a handful of votes that determine the fate. A.J. Cameron, the candidate running in Roland Park, the seat that he's running for last election cycle was determined by 4 votes. So,
so you were telling us that elections do count?
Elections do count, and local elections like this, you definitely have the biggest impact when you go and cast your ballot.
Now, when you put a show like this together every week, it's tough to get to every story making the headlines. What was the big story we missed?
It's going to snow like crazy for a while.
Is it winter already? An early dose of snow and ice causes hundreds of crashes. Warming up to weed? A Kansas legislative panel nudges the state one step closer to legalizing medical marijuana. It's back to work at the GM Fairfax plant in KCK after 40 days on the picket line. The Business Journal claims the strike cost the Metro $20 million a week. Want to buy a water park? The future of Schlitterbahn back in limbo as the owner of Worlds of Fun pass on buying the shuttered attraction. A Kansas City man is now the head coach for the U.S. women's soccer team. Vlatko Andonovsky lives right here and is a graduate of Park University. And we already said farewell to Ned Yost. Now say hello to Mike Matheny. The former Cardinals skipper just announced as the new manager of the Kansas City Royals. Kat Reed, was it one of those options or something completely different?
It has to be the snow, I would say. You know, growing up in the Midwest, I had the misfortune of being Rapunzel in a turtleneck occasionally while trick-or-treating. So I feel bad for the kids who had to wear their warmest coats and trot around the neighborhoods. But it is really unusual, bizarre to have snow. We did a story actually the last time we had a major snowstorm, I think was 96.
They said it was the coldest Halloween in Kansas City
Coldest.
in over 25 years.
Yeah.
Coldest, yes. Dave Helling.
Well, I think the biggest story of the week that everyone missed, maybe the biggest story of the year, is that Dave Helling is a multi-millionaire. I know Dave Helling. I've talked to him. I don't think he's aware of that. So, but if it's true, it will really be a game changer. We'll have to keep our eye on it.
Okay, Eric Wesson.
I think that the fact that the prosecutor didn't charge the officer that killed Terrence Bridges for the homicide, because now Kansas City, Missouri police have a perfect record when it comes to killing their citizens of not getting charged.
Jay Center.
I think the change of the Royals manager is a pretty big deal. Mike Matheny is a pretty polarizing pick, so we will see how
Yes,
he
it took me all I had not to show the video of him going up face-to-face with an umpire at a game while he was the Cardinals manager, so he could be a little hot-headed. We'll see how all of that plays out here in Kansas City. That is our Week in Review. Our thanks to this week's news reviewers from 41 Action News, Kat Reed, and from the Shawnee Mission Post, Jay Center. From the Call newspaper, Eric Wesson and Dave Helling of the Kansas City Star. Remember, we couldn't put every single race on here on this program. If you go to kcpt.org/KCWIR, you can see back-to-back comparisons of all these candidates. Put in your zip code. Find out what races will be on your ballot in your neck of the woods. I'm Nick Haynes. From all of us here at KCPT, thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.